how's it going? My name is Gabby. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to my last video of 2025. In today's video, this is going to be my stats video, my year in review. This is one of my favorite videos to make on my channel, and it is also one of the most time-consuming videos to make because at the end of each year, I love to go through my stats and I take little tally marks for every single book that I've read in the year and put them into my journal. I know that there's probably much easier ways to do this, digitally instead of like trying to do it on paper, but I really like to do this by hand at the end of the year. I like to see all the different stats for the things that I like to keep track of when it comes to reading books. And if you were wondering, I am pulling these stats directly from my Goodreads and from my memory of like how I was able to read these books. And so I'm really excited because in this video, we're going to be talking about a lot of my stats from the year, but we're also going to be talking about stats not only from like my reading year, but also from my book club, the book troop. I'm also going to be giving some reading superlatives from the year, like something that felt like the biggest accomplishment to read, or books that didn't live up to the hype, or if they did live up to the hype. So before we get started, I'm going to crack open this little Witch's Brew Alani, because I fear we might be here for a while. This one is my favorite Alani, by the way, the Witch's Brew. It's like a caramel apple flavor that is just the best thing ever. Man, that's gonna give me the energy boost that I need to make it through this video. So if you also want to grab yourself a fun little drink, get all cozy, and let's get into my stats for the year. So first things first, in the year of 2025, I was able to read 251 books, which is the most amount of books that I've ever been able to read in any year ever. I do get a lot of questions asking how I'm able to read so much, and I want to be so transparent with you that YouTube is what I'm doing full time. YouTube and content creation and reading books right now is my full-time job, and I am so lucky to be doing this. I don't know if I'm going to be doing this forever, but it's what I'm doing right now. And 251 books in 1 year is like a crazy number to me, like something I never thought I was going to hit, and it feels really wonderful. But I also just want to emphasize that reading is never a competition. I was able to read 77,833 pages, which is also the most amount of pages that I've ever read in a year. I think the closest that I got was last year. I read 69,000 pages, but I've never broken the 70,000 pages. So looking at more of my stats, the shortest book that I read this year was The Indigo Room by Stephen Graham Jones. And this one was actually one of those like Amazon short stories. So it was only 35 pages. Like that's crazy. I've read a few of the Amazon short stories this year, and a lot of them only range from like 50 pages to like 80 pages. But this one is definitely the shortest of all of them. And unfortunately, I didn't really like The Indigo Room. I think I gave it like 2 stars. And then the longest book that I read this year was House of Leaves. And my God, House of Leaves had to also be like the biggest accomplishment. Like if I had to give a superlative, this would definitely be like the book that I felt the most accomplished to have finally read this book, because I've been saying that I would read this book for the last like 6 years, maybe 7 years. I've had this book just sitting on my shelves. It's been on my TBR almost every single October, and I read this book this year for the first time ever, and this was definitely the biggest accomplishment because what the heck even is this book? It's told in the most like unconventional format. Like there's some pages where you have to like hold this up to the mirror to read it. It is the most disorienting horror book that I've ever read, but I'm so glad that I finally read it this year because I really loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. According to Goodreads, my average book length in the year of 2025 was 310 pages, and it's a lot higher than last year, I think, because I think last year my average was like 290 something pages. That probably explains why my page count was a little bit higher this year. And then according to Goodreads, the most popular book that I read in the year of 2025 was actually Twilight, and 9.5 million people have shelved that book. And Twilight was actually a book that I reread this year because I actually took a trip to Forks, Washington, and I did a whole vlog where I reread the book Twilight. Then the least popular thing that I read this year was actually 7 Points by Amy James, which I just read this in December, and this book actually just published in December. Only 469 other people have shelved this book because this one is actually the sequel to the book Crash Test, which was one of my favorite romance books that I read this year. 7 Points is like the follow-up book. It's like a novella that follows these same characters, and I didn't love it as much as I loved Crash Test, but I'm still glad that I read it. My average rating for the year of 2025 was a 3.5 out of 5 stars, which honestly, that is kind of sad, and that's the lowest average rating that I've had since I think 2018. So for the last like 7-ish years, this is the lowest average rating year that I've ever had. I mean, I know 3.5 is still like pretty high, all things considered, but like I am kind of surprised because I feel like for the last 2 years in a row, I've been getting 3.7s. I had 3.6s before, but not a 3.5. So like that kind of sucks. That makes me look at my reading year a little bit differently, like what was going on. It is kind of shocking to me too whenever I get these lower average ratings, because if you know me, you know that I DNF a lot of books. Like I am just out here DNFing left and right lately. So can you imagine if I had finished all of those books that I initially DNF'd and probably wouldn't have liked? Like this average rating would probably be so much lower if I did that. The highest rated book on Goodreads that I read this year was actually Dungeon Crawler Carl, which has an average rating of a 4.45 out of 5 on Goodreads. Like that is so high, especially for like the first book in a series. But that's amazing, and I love it for this author because Dungeon Crawler Carl is such a massive success right now. Like I feel like I've seen this book everywhere, and this is like the first book in a series of books. I've still only read the first one. So fun, and if I had to give a superlative for this book this year, it would be the best audiobook that I listened to all year. This audiobook is fantastic. I mean, it is annoying that the audiobook is only available through Audible. Like I hate that, but it is the best audiobook I think that I've listened to this year. And if you're gonna listen to any audiobooks, let it be this one because it's so entertaining, because it's like a sci-fi fantasy book and it kind of involves this like game show type of thing. There's like really cool sound effects on the audiobook, and the narrator in general is just so good at like the comedic timing, and he was just making me laugh so much. And then something cool that I wanted to point out is that my very first book that I read this year was a 5-star book, Welcome to the Hyunamdong Bookshop, that ended up making it into my top 3 favorite books that I read this year. I feel like it's almost the opposite kind of a situation where like the first book that I read in the year is usually like one of the lowest rated books that I have in the year. So for 2025 to be like the opposite, where I gave a book 5 stars for my first read of the year, like that feels incredibly lucky to me. And then the last book that I read in 2025 was the Josh Mallerman nonfiction book, and this was a 4-star for me, so like we're ending the year on a strong note as well. All right, so jumping into my stats that I pull from my journal, the first thing I thought would be interesting to look at is the month-to-month breakdown. And so if you look at this chart on the screen here, you can see how many books I was reading each month. In January, I read 22 books. In February, I read 17. In March, I read 15. April, I read 29 books. May, I read 17. June, I read 22. July, I read 20. August, I read 21. September, I read 23. October, I read 18. November, I read 23. And December, I read 25. Okay, first thing that's interesting about these stats to me is that I read 25 books in December, which is very unusual for me. Usually, actually, in the month of December is when I'm a lot more focused on like my end of the year content as opposed to reading. So usually in an average December, I would not be reading that much. But I feel like this December in particular was really different for me because I feel like I was going through a lot of things in December, and it was actually a really shitty month for me. And so I guess that does make sense that I was relying a lot more on books to like distract me from what was going on in my life. And April was the first with 29 books read in April. You know, I think I remember that too, because I remember in April the fact that I worked on like 6 reading vlogs within 1 month, and I was like, what am I doing? Like, this is crazy. And so I was very aware of the fact that I was reading a lot in April. Like, that was insane. I think I read a little bit less in February and March because that was actually when I was moving. The next chart that I wanted to look at is the physical versus ebook versus audiobook, because if you look at this chart, I think it's hilarious that I've read 176 audiobooks this year. I've read 45 physical books and then 31 ebooks. You know, oftentimes I am listening to the audiobook while I'm reading the book physically sometimes, but for the sake of this chart, if I did listen to it on audiobook at any point, I marked it down in here because I really wanted to see how often I was relying on the audiobook instead of just reading a book physically. And so it doesn't really surprise me that I listened to 176 audiobooks this year. Like, that's an excessive amount. If you were wondering, I'm mostly using my library for audiobooks, so I'm not always paying for the audiobooks because I know the audiobooks can be so expensive. I mean, I do have a Libro subscription, so I am paying for audiobooks from time to time, but I'm mostly using Libby for my audiobooks. I also do use Spotify to listen to my audiobooks, by the way, and you get 15 hours a month for free if you have a membership on Spotify, so I've definitely been taking advantage of that this year. But like, wow, then we have 45 physical books that I read and then 31 ebooks, which I'm really interested in this stat because that's the highest that it's been in a long time, because I actually got my very first Kindle last November. And so this is like my first full year having a Kindle, and like one of my goals that I had for myself this year was to read at least 2 books on my Kindle every single month. And so I mean, the fact that I read 31 books on my Kindle this year, I mean, I think that's great because then I definitely achieved my goal of reading at least 2 per month. For the longest time, I kept wondering, like, am I even ever going to use a Kindle? Like, should I even bother with one? And I'm so glad that I got one because I definitely utilize it a lot more than I thought I would. I also thought with this stat, it would be interesting to point out that out of the 45 physical books that I read this year, 9 of those were manga, but I actually only read 9 manga this year, which is so crazy compared to like years in the past. Because I think last year I set a goal for myself to read at least 50 manga in the year, and I was able to achieve that goal. And so the fact that this year I only read 9 manga for the entire year. Damn, I have definitely fallen off my manga game. But okay, the next chart that I wanted to look at is my average ratings. So if we look here, I had 43 books that I gave 5 stars. I had 87 books that I gave 4 stars, 83 books that I gave 3 stars, 30 books that I gave 2 stars, and 8 books that I gave 1 star. You know, I DNF books quite often. And so I do feel like I spared myself from having a lot more books in the 1 and 2 star territory down there. But like, wow, I am pretty thrilled with that reading year. I mean, the fact that I had 43 5-star books, I think that's great. And I'm glad to know that I did have more 4-star reads than 3-star reads, even though there's not that big of a margin right there. I feel like with these numbers, you can definitely see why I had closer to a 3.5 average rating this year, because there was actually a lot of 3-star books, like a lot. All right, the next chart that I wanted to look at is my authors that I've read this year. I wanted to see if I read more from male or female authors, because usually it's always the case that I'm reading more female authors. Like, that's just how my reading goes. And this year's no different, because this year I read 177 female authors, I read 57 male authors, and then I read 14 either non-binary authors, or maybe it was part of some kind of collection where they had multiple authors. And you know, the most interesting thing to me from this stat is that my #1 author of the year with Don't Let the Forest In is non-binary. So like, my #1 author came from that small stat, which is amazing, and I love that. And I also love the fact that I'm reading more women typically. I mean, that's usually how my reading goes. I thought now would be a good time too to point out my most read authors of the year. And I actually got these stats from Fable, but according to Fable, my most read author of the year was Stephen King, because I read 4 books by Stephen King this year, which is crazy that I've read that much Stephen King, but it's also like, because I'm not a big series reader, it's not usual for me to read a lot of books from the same author within 1 year, but I think it makes sense with Stephen King because, I mean, not only did I do an entire dedicated Stephen King reading vlog again this year, which I haven't done in a while, but I read 3 books just within that vlog, and so it makes sense that Stephen King is my most read author of the year with 4 books, but I also think that's still really surprising to me. But then some of my other highest read authors include Cara Bastone, Grady Hendrix, and Jenny Han, with 3 books each, because I did read the entire Summer I Turned Pretty trilogy this year. And then speaking of authors, I thought now would also be a good time to look at the chart where we look at whether I'm reading more authors that are new to me or authors that I've read before. And if you look at this chart here, you'll see that I've read 132 new authors, like new to me authors that I've never read before, and I read 119 authors that I have read from before. And I think it's so great, you know, that I am reading a lot of books from authors that I've never read before. You know, I really thought by the time that I got to like this point in my reading life, you know, where like I've been on booktube now for 10 years and I've been reading so many, like hundreds of books every single year, and I really thought that I would get to a point where I was mostly reading from authors that I've read before, but I love being proven wrong because I love the fact that I'm reading more from new authors. Another fun little stat that I had from this year was that I only read 13 young adult books in the entire year, which was including some manga that I was reading, by the way, because anything that was considered young adult, even for manga, I included in those stats. And by the way, if I had to give a superlative for my favorite manga that I've read this year, it has to be this series, The Moon on a Rainy Night. I've read 4 volumes of this manga this year, and it is just so freaking cute and so freaking wholesome, and it's a young adult sapphic romance between these 2 young girls. But a stat from this that I thought was kind of interesting is the fact that Don't Let the Forest In was my #1 book that I read this year, and this was a young adult horror romance book. So I just think it's really cool that out of the 13 young adult books that I read this year, my #1 was included in that. Another thing that I like to look at is what year the books were published in that I've been reading this year, because I've been known to prioritize new release books. I can't help myself, you know, I get very excited about the new releases. And so if you look at this chart, it is not surprising information to see that I read 141 books that were published in 2025. I read 38 books that were published in 2024, and then I read 69 books that were published before 2024. And then I also read 3 books that will be publishing in 2026 that were arcs for me. So the fact that I only read 69 books for this entire year that were published before 2024, like, that's wild. I think this just goes to show why I like doing my backlist bonanza episodes and like why those are so important to me, because clearly with my reading and my taste, like, I tend to want to prioritize the new release books because I get really excited about the new releases that people are talking about. I want to be in the know. I want to be able to recommend you things that are current and like coming out. And so because of that, I really love doing my backlist bonanza episodes, because to be honest, I don't know if I'd be reading as much of my backlist if it wasn't for those. And if you were wondering, some of the oldest books that I read this year, like the book that I read that was published the longest time ago was actually Carmilla, which first published in 1872. And that one was the oldest by like a long shot, because some of the runner-ups include Interview with the Vampire, which published in 1976. I also had Stepford Wives, which came out in 1972. Those are all of the oldest books that I read this year. And so now if we look at genre, this is definitely the one that I get the most intrigued about personally, because I do feel like my reading has changed a little bit over the years. It's just wild to me that like before the year of 2020, I was not reading a lot of horror. Like that was definitely not one of my top genres, whereas now, for the past couple of years in a row, horror has been my #1 genre. And I feel like every year I'm reading less and less thrillers. I also feel like a big difference in my reading this year is that I've been starting to get more into sci-fi. So if we break it down and look at the numbers, I read 43 thrillers this year. I read 60 romance books. I read 78 horror books. And then I read 24 literary fiction books. I read 15 sci-fi books, 9 historical books, 10 fantasy books, 9 nonfiction books, and 2 classics. So like, wow, isn't that crazy? I mean, it's not surprising to see that horror has once again won my most read genre of the year. And it's actually not that surprising to me now to see that romance is my #2 genre, because I feel like it's been that way also for the last like 2 years, because I feel like thrillers have gotten more and more disappointing to me and I'm reaching for them a little bit less than I used to. But I mean, hey, I still read 43 thrillers this year. Like that is still one of my top read genres. And I also think it's hilarious that out of the 9 nonfiction books that I read 6 of them in the month of December. And I thought now would be a really great time to shout out some of my favorite nonfiction books that I read this year, because I read I Was Feeling Epic, which is a book about the Vampire Diaries, and this was like one of my favorite things that I read this year. Basically, this entire book is told from the creators of the show, from the crew, the writers, the actors, and you hear from everyone that was involved about all the different things that were going on behind the scenes. Oh my god, it was so juicy and so fun. I also ended up loving Your Favorite Scary Movie. This is another one that's all about the Scream franchise. I love nonfiction stuff like this that's been coming out lately that's about something that I'm really into, like either a TV show or a movie franchise, where you kind of get to hear from the writers and the creators and the actors themselves about what it was like. I also really loved reading a lot of the nonfiction books from the Gilmore Girls cast, because I also watched Gilmore Girls for the first time ever this year. And so I loved reading Talking as Fast as I Can by Lauren Graham. I love her so much. Lorelai Gilmore is one of my favorite fictional characters of all time now, and this was so comforting. Some other fun little stat things that I thought you might like to know is that out of all of my Book of the Month books, I was able to read 13 of my books from Book of the Month this year. And then I also have an Aardvark subscription now that I've been using almost the entire year. I was able to read 8 of the books that I got from Aardvark this year. I also took a little stat from my library because I wanted to see like how many of these books I was actually able to get from my library. And this year, 64 of the books that I read this year came from my library. So like, what the heck? That's amazing. Shout out to my local library for being a real one. I also had 3 books that I reread this year. It was not a big rereading year for me. I honestly thought that I was gonna reread a lot more than I did. And the only 3 rereads that I had this year were Twilight, because of the Forks vlog that I mentioned. And then I also reread Bunny right before We Love You Bunny came out. And then the last one was me rereading Julie Chan is Dead before the booktube live show in December. And then I also like to take a note of like how many of the books that I was reading include any kind of like LGBT representation. And according to my stats, I've read 47 books this year that have LGBT characters as like some of the main characters in the story. I think it would be fun also to look at stats from some of my best books of the year compared to my worst books of the year. Because if we look at my best books of the year, these were my top 15 books that I had this year. In this top 15, I have 6 horror books, I have 3 literary fiction books, I have 3 romances, 2 sci-fis, and 1 thriller. And I think that's amazing that like horror books are once again dominating my top 15, and I feel like that explains why it's my most read genre, because it's my most loved genre. Another stat that I thought was really interesting from my top 15 is that out of the entire top 15, I only have 2 authors that I've read from before, and the rest of them are all new to me authors. And if you were wondering, with all the books in my top 15, the only 2 authors that I've read from before included Nat Cassidy and Jessie Q. Sutanto. So both of these books are from authors that I have read some of their other books before, but everything else in my top 15, these are all authors that were new to me authors and reading their books for the first time. And so I'm like, how special is that? That so many of my favorites came from new authors that I've never read before. Like that just makes me so excited. And then also some stats from my worst books that I read this year that I thought you might be interested in knowing. Out of the 12 worst books that I read this year, I had 5 thrillers in there, I had 5 horror books, and I had 2 romance books. And I did have 2 books from Frida McFadden in my top 12. And with these stats, I had 5 authors that I was reading from for the first time, whereas I had 7 authors that I've read from before. So you can see that like I have the opposite problem, you know, happening here, where like authors that I've read from before are the ones who are letting me down. All right, so if we look at some stats from my book club, the book troop this year, because as you can see, these were the 12 different picks that we had this year. And unfortunately for me, I only had 2 books that I gave 5 stars to that are like new all-time favorites of mine. And that is When the Wolf Comes Home and Julie Chan is Dead. So these are the only 2 books that I really truly loved for the book club this year and that I would give like 5 stars stars to. I mean, don't get me wrong, I did have a few other books that I rated highly. I mean, I did really enjoy The Ghostwriter and I liked 13 Months Haunted. I had a few different 3 stars like Tell Me What You Did, Immaculate Conception, and With a Vengeance. And then the rest of them ended up being around like 2 stars for me, like very forgettable. Dark Places, Beautiful Ugly, Listen to Your Sister, How to Survive a Horror Story, and Matchmaking for Psychopaths were all books that I gave around 2 stars that I was just pretty disappointed by all of those. So yeah, that is a bummer, especially comparing this year of the book troop to last year, because last year was the best year that I ever had for the book troop, because last year I think I gave 6 out of the 12 books a 5-star or a 4.5 star. So I feel like this year in comparison, like nothing was ever going to beat last year's book club picks for me, you know? I also did end up asking my Patreon like what their favorite book troop pick of this year was, and When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy ended up winning that poll by a lot. So I would like to know in the comments, like out of all the 12 book troop picks that we had this year, what book ended up being your favorite? I mean, I would agree that my favorite is also When the Wolf Comes Home, and I think if you haven't read this one, I think you should definitely check it out, and then you can watch the live show afterwards, because we had a really great live show discussion with this one. I had Gavin on and Steph on. Okay, next thing, I just wanted to talk about a few different like book superlatives. One of the superlatives that I like to do is like a book that lived up to the hype this year. I think one of those has got to be Wild Dark Shore by Charlotte McConaughey, because this book I was highly anticipating, especially this year after loving Once There Were Wolves last year. That book made it into my top 3 books of last year, which was from this author. And so I went into this with such high expectations. I heard that this book was incredible and emotional and so moving. And for me, it definitely lived up to that hype. Like I thought this book was incredible. It was a 5-star read for me and I felt so connected to these characters. And then some books that did not live up to the hype for me, unfortunately. I have 2 books that come to mind immediately because I know that everyone and their mom was obsessed with Atmosphere. And I'm so sad that I didn't love this. I gave it 3 stars. I thought it was fine. But honestly, like I really don't think that this book lived up to the hype, and that kills me because Taylor Jenkins Reid is one of my favorite authors. The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo might be my favorite book of all time. And the fact that I just didn't really love this one that much, like I thought it was okay, never really felt emotional while I was reading it the way that I expected to. I'm just so sad that I didn't really get the hype with this book. And then another one that immediately comes to mind is The Favorites by Lane Fargo. This is another one that I thought I was going to love it. I thought it would be my new favorite thing ever because I love messy romance books and I also love, you know, ice skating and figure skating and the drama. Like I live for it. And for some reason, this book was so incredibly boring. It was just so boring and I didn't care about anything. And I gave it 3 stars, like it was fine, but it just was not the book that I thought I was going to read. This year, I also hosted a few different readathons, including Winterween, which I hosted back in January. And this year it was so cute because our theme was kind of like this haunted house, kind of like ghosty cabin kind of a theme. It was really fun because I ended up rewriting the song Fortnight by Taylor Swift for the music video that I filmed with my sister. And we had such a great time and this was such a memorable Winterween for me. And then in the summertime, I hosted another round of Summerween, and this time we did a really cute like desert cactus alien theme, which I loved the way that this theme turned out and I thought it was so cute. For the music video, I actually decided to rewrite Taste by Sabrina Carpenter, mostly because I had this idea and this vision for the music video, and I feel like this music video has got to be the best one that we've put out yet because of the amount of detail that I put into the storyboarding with like both of us trying to like sabotage each other. I just had a lot of fun working on this one. This Summerween was also like extra special because my friend Jan actually flew out and visited me for like the last 4 days of Summerween and we just had so much fun. I also ended up hosting 3 rounds of Screaming Color on my Patreon this year, and Screaming Color is a 48-hour readathon that I love to host that involves colors. So the only prompt for the readathon is to read a book with a certain color on the cover, and this year I ended up doing pink back in March. I also did white in June, and then recently in November, for the first time ever, I did a mix of 2 colors, so we did orange and teal. And I'm really excited for 2026 actually because I think going forward it's going to be a mashup of 2 colors, and I can't wait. I think it's going to be so much fun. Then I also thought I would talk about some of the videos that I'm most proud of that I made this year, because maybe if you're a new subscriber or maybe if you missed some of my videos this year, these are the ones that I'm the most proud of. I mean, my number one has to be the one where 10 booktubers control my TBR for my 10-year booktube anniversary. This video was such a massive project that I took on, and this video was like 2 months in the making basically. This video was the most ambitious thing that I've ever worked on for my channel because I've never read 10 books for one video before, but I also feel like it was one of the most successful videos that I've ever had on my channel because not only did I end up reading my number one favorite book that I read this year was in that video, recommended by my friend Lexi, so thank you. But I also ended up reading House of Leaves because of that video, thanks to my friend Kayla. I mean, at the time I was like, dear God, like how am I ever gonna make this work? And like trying to read House of Leaves in a video where I'm reading 10 other books, like it felt like it was gonna be such a daunting thing, and it was. But I'm also really glad that I finally got the chance to read House of Leaves because of that video. And then I also ended up making a spin-off video on my Patreon that was just reading House of Leaves because I had so much to say about this book, and this book was such an experience. But I made so many videos that I'm proud of this year. I mean, I know I've been talking a lot about the like reading Twilight and Forks video is definitely a very memorable video for me. I love any videos where I get to like travel to somewhere I've never been before. I also ended up going on my New York trip with Gavin this year, and we went to New York and Manhattan, and we also went to Sleepy Hollow. Those were some of my favorite vlogs that I made this year. I did an entire reading vlog where I read The Summer I Turned Pretty trilogy, and like that was one of my favorite things to do this year. And then even the reading vlog where I read some horror books from Reddit, that was definitely one of my favorites that I made this year because I've been wanting to do that video for so long. And I'm glad that I did, and I think I might actually make that like a series on my channel next year where I try to do a few more episodes of like reading book recommendations from Reddit because of how much fun that was. And I did end up finding a book from that video that ended up in my top 15 of the year. And then also on my Patreon this year, I do have a number of different videos that I'm really proud of that I made this year. On my highest tier on my Patreon, I'm offering exclusive videos every single month, and most months I'm offering 2 videos. And this is a look at some of the videos that I'm most proud of that I made this year. I mean, as you'll see from this graphic, it's a lot of monthly vlogs because I've been posting a lot of monthly vlogs to Patreon this year just because I've had a lot of stuff going on in my life this year. I mean, the fact that my little sister got married in September and I had one of the best summers of my life this summer, like it was a really, really great year for the most part. And I'm just so happy with and proud of the content that I've been making over on my Patreon. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for an incredible 2025. Whether you're supporting me here on YouTube or over on my Patreon, I appreciate your support no matter what. Anytime that you're watching my videos, if you're liking my videos, leaving a comment, it literally means the world to me. I can't even begin to tell you how lucky I am to be able to do this full time for another year. You know, as of December this year, it's been 4 years since I've been able to do YouTube full time, and it's been such an incredible 4 years, and I feel so grateful. I mean, as I mentioned at the start of this video, like I don't know if this is something I'm going to be doing forever, but I really do appreciate that I'm able to do it right now. I'm also just so grateful that I'm still this passionate about reading books and sharing my love of books with you. Like it's just something that I really love to do. And so thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your engagement. 2025 has been such an incredible year. Thank you so much for being a part of my year by being here and watching my videos. It literally means so much to me. So those are all of my stats for the year. I would love to know some of your stats, like how many books did you read this year? How many pages did you read this year? What was the best manga? What was the best nonfiction? What was your favorite book of the year? You can let me know any of your stats down below in the comments. Like I would genuinely love to know. Like I'm gonna be reading these comments. And thank you so much for watching as always. Happy New Year, and I will see you in 2026. Bye!